All right, let's get started. So last week we had spoken about how we figure it all out, right? We are going to be embarking on life's biggest questions pertaining to how we function with God in this world, the next world, afterlife, Mashiach, resurrection of the dead, these major topics, and also topics that are more practical to my everyday life, that are also very important questions related to free will, for example, is a topic that we're going to be spending a lot of time on, and questions of how we can comprehend and how we can reconcile the fact that there is divine foreknowledge, that God understands everything and knows the future, but at the same time, I have free will. And so these are the types of questions we're going to be getting to. And we had spoken about the importance of learning machshava, of learning Jewish philosophy. We learned from Rabbi Soloveitchik. He explained that basically is that through learning the Torah, one gets a guide for how to deal with anything that life could throw at them. So it starts with learning the basics of Jewish fundamental thought and principles and the like, and then delving into the halacha, delving into the way that we're supposed to practice the 613 mitzvos, and then through that we're supposed to come out with a way to live life in a holistic sense, how to live life in general. So that is basically what the purpose of all this is. So then at the end of class, Dr. Lincoln asked, well, how do we understand the fact that we just said that learning Torah is really supposed to be a vehicle for me to be able to function in my life in a very practical way, right? Whenever there is a major issue that comes up, that's not what I mean major issue. I'm not talking about what bracha do you make on, cornflakes, right? That's not right. That's not what we're talking about. Or whether or not, what is it now? This new pork product that Jack told me about, the Impossible Pork needs a hechsher, right? So that's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about things related to social justice issues and things related to picking a candidate, in an election, in a divisive election, how to sit at a Shabbos table with people that are of such different views that you have, and how to deal with things like vaccine mandates, and how to deal with things like coming to shul while some people want to sit outside. How to deal with these kinds of issues that you can't necessarily open up a Shulchan Aruch and know this is the right thing to do, but you have to rather have a general holistic perspective. How do you gain that holistic perspective? And we said that always comes through the study of Torah. So Stuart asked, but that's not what the Mishnah says is the purpose of the study of Torah. The Mishnah points out that really the highest level of study of Torah is limad haTorah lishma, of learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah, for its own sake, is the basic way to translate that Gemara, or that Mishnah. Learning Torah for its own sake. That's really the purpose of, that is the highest level of learning Torah. So I want to discuss the entire concept of learning Torah in general, why it is that we're so crazy about learning Torah, which is also a major question in Judaism and Jewish philosophy, something that definitely does set us aside from other religions, is a quest for truth through the study of Torah that does not necessarily exist in other religions, or at least not in as systematic of a way that we have it in the yeshivas, for example. And first of all, talk about learning Torah in general, and also to be able to understand what actually is the highest level of learning Torah, in order to reconcile, well, if it's learning Torah just for the sake of learning Torah, so then Rabbi Soloveitchik was wrong when he said that learning Torah to understand the 613 mitzvos, and through doing that, you come out with a holistic perspective of how to live life in general. That should not be your pursuit of why you learn Torah. You should learn Torah because we want to learn Torah. That's the bottom line. So let's dive right in. First of all, this is an old question. This is a very old question of are we supposed to be able to get something more out of learning Torah than just simply the study itself, the intrinsic study itself, which there are a lot of primary sources that indicate as such that the study of Torah itself is something we're supposed to do just for its own sake. For example, you walk into many of the kollels in Eretz Yisrael. Many of the kollels in Israel are studying esoteric topics that, practically speaking, most likely are never going to come up in our daily lives. Moreover, we find that we spend so much time studying opinions that we don't even paskin like. We study opinions that have absolutely no practical ramifications. For example, we spend so much time studying all of the opinions of the house of Shammai, of Beis Shammai. We don't practice like Beis Shammai except for 6 areas of Torah law. That's it. It's the only time we practice like Beis Shammai. And yet, we spend so much time studying the ideas of Beis Shammai. So there's a lot of primary sources that indicate the fact that we study Torah just for its own sake. So this is an old question as to whether or not there is anything more that we can get out of studying Torah. And in fact, the Sakhachev Rebbe of Avram Bornstein was born at the beginning of the 19th century, died in 1910, was a super genius, is what the way Rabbi Soloveitchik referred to him, was a super genius, which if I call somebody a genius, that may not be a compliment for them. But if Rabbi Soloveitchik calls the person a super genius, that obviously is quite an accolade. And the Sakhachev Rebbe wrote, he was the Rebbe of the Sakhachev community, a Hasidic community. He wrote mostly in halachic matters, which is unusual for a Hasidic Rebbe. He wrote, first of all, his Shilos Chuvos Avnei Nezer, his response to Avnei Nezer, that are studied all over yeshivas. Probably, though, his most famous work is the work that he wrote on the laws of Shabbos. It's called the Eglaital. Eglaital, play on words. Tal is backwards, is written backwards for Lamed Tet, referencing the 39 of the Malachos. The Eglaital is perhaps the most famous of his works on the 39 categories of labor that we are not allowed to do on Shabbos. It's a fantastic piece of literature. In his introduction to the Eglaital, he brings down over there a question. This question was posed to him by his students. His students asked him, they said that, people say that you're not supposed to enjoy the learning that you do. You're not supposed to enjoy your learning. Why? Because there's a Gemara that says that mitzvos, lav lahanaos nitnu, that mitzvos were not given for me to enjoy them. If I enjoy them, it's fine. Okay, good. All right, why not? Right? You have to, ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, like David HaMelech says, you have to serve God with a sense of joy. But from the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah, that is not supposed to be the source of the enjoyment. The source of the enjoyment is me connecting to God. Learning Torah should apply the same principle. That, yes, I should enjoy the fact that I'm getting closer to God through my study of the Torah, but the actual Torah itself should not give me any joy. So when I really enjoy my learning, that should theoretically be a problem, is what they posed to the Rebbe, the Eglaital. And the Eglaital said, you got it completely wrong. He said, not only is it not a problem, but it is actually the highest level of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah, is if you enjoy it. He actually explains why in a very, very interesting way. He says the reason is because when you enjoy something, so then it's going to stick to your memory better. It's going to become more a part of you, right? Think back to the most enjoyable moments of your life. The most enjoyable moments of your life are the most vivid moments of your life. It's the moments of your life that you really have stuck to memory. The more that you learn and the more you're enjoying it while you're learning it, so then the more it's going to become a part of you. The language he uses, nivlayin b'dmo, it becomes absorbed into your bloodstream. It becomes a part of you. It's like what they used to say about Rav Shach Zatzal, whose 20th yortzeit was just a couple of days ago. They used to say about Rav Shach, was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Panovich Yeshiva, passed away at the age of 107. Just passed away 20 years ago. They used to say about him that if Rav Shach ever got a cut, so what would come out of his body wouldn't be blood. It would be Rabbi Kiva Eger's and Rashbas and Gemaras and Rishonim, and that's what would come out of his blood. It would not be. That's what would come out of his body. It wouldn't be blood. It would be, because that the more you learn, the more you enjoy, the more it becomes a part of you. Though the Mishnah does say it's actually not a Mishnah. Everybody says that it's a Mishnah. It's really not a Mishnah. The Pirkei Avos has 6 chapters. The first 5 chapters were Mishnayos. Mishnayos is what was edited by a Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the end of the 2nd century, and that is what was edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, as a collection of basically all of Torah, all of our oral traditions into one collected area in order not to lose the traditions. And then there were other teachings as well. He didn't get everything down. There were other teachings as well. This is what is quoted all over Rashi ala Torah, Rashi on Chumash, on almost every single pasuk. He's quoting from the Mechilta, or he's quoting from the Torah's Kohanim. He's quoting from this other Tanaic literature from the same era of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, just was not included in the Mishnayos. These are what was referred to as brisos, which is just the fancy Aramaic way of saying Tanaic teachings of the sages from that time period, the 1st and 2nd century. The 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos is a collection of scholarly teachings from that time period, but it actually was not included in the Mishnayos, the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos. And that's why the Mishnah starts off with, or the Brisa starts off with, Shanu Chachamim B'lashon HaMishnah, that our rabbis taught this in the same language that they taught the Mishnah, meaning to say that it has the same level of we take it just as seriously as we would take a Mishnah. So the Brisa says as follows. Rabbi Meir says as follows. Kol ha'osik b'Torah lishma, which we'll put in quotes right now. Anyone that learns Torah lishma, for its sake. So I have to define what that means. Zoche lidvarim harbe, is going to merit many, many things. It's a tremendous reward for such a person. What are the rewards? Oh, not only that, not only will they be merit many, many things. Ella, listen to these words. Rather, shekol ha'olam kulo kedai hulo, that it would be worth it for God to create the world just for that person. That if you have such a person that learns Torah just for its sake, it'd be enough to create the whole world just for that person. It's like Rav Chaim Volozhin used to say that that I forget who he said it about. There was a specific student that learned so well in the Volozhin Yeshiva. Rav Chaim Volozhin said that all of the fundraising and everything that I did to set up the Volozhin Yeshiva was all worth it just for that one student. So it would be enough to create the whole world just for this one individual if you learn Torah, quote unquote, lishma, for its own sake. Now, remember we said zochel advarim harbe. You're going to merit many, many things. What are those things? So the Brisa goes on to list all of these things. Listen to this. Nikareya, that you're going to be called a friend. Ahuv, you're going to be a beloved person. Oev asamakom, you're going to be a person that loves God. Oev asabrios, a person that loves the other creations. Misamech asamakom, you give a lot of joy to God. Misamech asabrios, you give a lot of joy to other people. And it just goes on and on and on. Accolade after accolade that a person is going to be if they learn Torah, quote unquote, just lishma. Now, hold on one second. I have met a lot of Torah learners in my life. A lot of Baruch Hashem, I've been zocheh, been very blessed to meet a lot of people that sit and learn Torah. Some of them are wonderful people. They are mentioned that you wouldn't believe, like mamish tzaddikim. When I see them, I ask them for brachas because they are people that are mamish tzaddikim. Then you have other people that sit in the base medrash 18 hours a day, but you can't stand their company. They're frankly, they're jerks. So what is the Mishnah talking about? They learn Torah lishma. You wouldn't believe the Torah they learn. They can write svarim today till tomorrow. But oev sabrios, people love them. People, I don't know, maybe God loves them. I don't love them. I can't stand them. So what's going on here, right? So we have to define then what lishma means. So in order to understand this properly, there's 2 other sources in our Chazal in the Talmud we have to see. Number 1 is the Gemara Psachim on Daf Nun Amud Beis. The Gemara says as follows: La'olam, that a person should always ya'asok adam. A person should always conduct themselves b'Torah u'mitzvos, through learning Torah and fulfillment of mitzvos their entire lives. Afapi, and even though shelo lishma, that it's not going to be, again, using that key phrase, lishma, for its own sake, nevertheless, you should still involve yourself your entire life lo lishma. Umitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. And even though, you're not going to be studying the Torah for its own sake, nevertheless, the goal is that ultimately what's going to end up happening is that it's going to be for its own sake. So the Gemara basically is giving you is telling you that it's okay. You don't need to be Reb Chaim Kanievsky, starting from day one. Starting from day one, just sit and learn Torah. Whatever your motive is, it seems to not be a problem. Even if you have ulterior motives for learning, it's okay. Eventually, hopefully, you will become, using that key phrase again, hopefully it will become lishma. But then there seems to be a completely contradictory Gemara. The Gemara in Brachos and Daf Yud Zayin contradicts what we just said. It says, Kol ha'oseh shelo lishma, if a person actually does learn not for its own sake, person learns Torah for ulterior motives, so then, very harsh language, Noach lo shelo nivra, better they were never created. Oh my gosh. So on the one hand, I have the Gemara himself, him telling me that, don't worry, just learn, right? Just learn. Eventually you'll be lishma, hopefully, maybe, probably not. Nevertheless, just sit and learn, even if it's not for its own sake. And then you have the Gemara in Brachos saying, but if you do that, better you were never created. What's going on here? So Rashi and Tosos basically give the same answer. Tosos says as follows. He says, Yesh Lomar, say as follows. The hachamari she'eno lomed ella lekanter chavera. That when we say that if you learn Torah not for its own sake, better that you're never created, that's if your ulterior motive is simply just to try and one up your friends. That if you're learning Torah just so that you can walk in, like Rabbi Schechter tells a story that he remembers when he was in Rabbi Soloveitchik's class in YU, that there was one student there that learned Torah day and night for one purpose. He had one goal in mind. What was his goal? That he wanted to learn so well that he can stump Rabbi Soloveitchik. That was his one goal. His one goal, his whole life was, I want to be able to stump Rabbi Soloveitchik. That is what the Gemara in Brachos was talking about. Better that person was probably never created. In fact, Rabbi Schechter says that the person went on to be a Rosh Yeshiva somewhere. He's still a jerk, and all of his Talmidim are jerks. That's that. But then, when the Gemara says that, you know what, you should still learn, even if it's not lishma, and eventually you'll become lishma, that's someone who Tosos says, that's someone who they have ulterior motives, but their ulterior motives are not necessarily bad motives. It's that they want to learn in order so that they can become a Talmid Chacham. They want to learn in order so that honor will be bestowed upon them over the fact that they have reached a certain level of Torah scholarship. Not just so that they can beat out other people, not so that they can just play competition with everyone else, but it's almost like for both purposes. I want to learn Torah so that way I know as much Torah as possible, and therefore I'll be able to get honor. Why will I get honor? I'll get honor because I know and I teach Torah and I have a yeshiva. And the Netziv actually had a different answer to this, or maybe a little bit of a spin on the same idea, where the Netziv, he actually writes this in a few different places. He has this in the Meshav Dover, his Chuvas. He has this in the Hamek Sheila. He has this in a few different places. The Netziv, or Naftali Tzviuta Berlin, Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin Yeshiva, as he was married to the granddaughter of the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva. He was married to the granddaughter of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. So Reb Chaim Volozhiner founded the yeshiva in the year 1801. Then his son, Reb Itzla Volozhiner, or Reb Yitzchak Volozhiner, took over the yeshiva. I forget what year exactly, and something in the 1830s or something like that. And then the Netziv married Reb Itzla's daughter, and he took over the yeshiva in 1853. And it was really under the Netziv's guidance and him being at the helm that the yeshiva became really what it lasted as in Jewish history until its closing in 1892 due to the Russian government's heavy hand in requiring them to teach. Basically, it became like a university, and they only had enough time for maybe like an hour and a half of Torah study a day. It's a very, very sad story. So it ended. The Netziv had to close the yeshiva in 1892. He died he died 1 year later, 1893, unfortunately, just due to the fact that his heart couldn't take it anymore. So Netziv actually has a little bit of a spin on this, where the Netziv says that when Tosos means that you learn Torah for ulterior motives versus learning Torah, and the ulterior motives are bad versus good, he says that there's basically two reasons why one would either write a sefer or one would open up a shul or open up a yeshiva. There could be two reasons for that. Number one is you see opening up a yeshiva as a good business opportunity. That, he says, is lo lishma. That's what do you do? You're just doing it for your own sake, right? As you're taking God completely out of the equation. You just think that you can make a pretty penny by opening up a yeshiva. Then there is lishma. Or even if it's not perfectly lishma, but it's kind of lishma, and that would be you want to continue on the Masorah. Now, are you perfect? No. But you feel as though having a shul, like take the shul in La Jolla, for example, right? This shul was set up for the most perfect motive, right? It was in order so that Jews in San Diego have a place to learn Torah, right? A place to continue the Masorah, right? There were no negative ulterior motives here. No one, when the shul was set up, 30, right? We have founders here of the shul, right? When the Lincolns and Rabbi Eglaital and the Niemans and the founders of the shul got together to set up the shul, did anyone think in their mind, you know what, this is great, we're going to make bank on this place, right? No, I can guarantee you, for the way the president is here, he'll tell you from the fundraising that is not the case, not at all. It was in order to continue the Masorah. So that's the Netziv's answer. So till now, let's just review to what we have till now. What we have till now is, number one, learning Torah lishma, quote unquote lishma, tells me that it is the highest level to learn Torah. And how do I know? Because the Mishnah says that if a person learns Torah for its own sake, so then you are going to inherit all of these amazing accolades. You are going to be a person that is loved and beloved, and Hashem loves you, and everything's perfect, and your life is perfect, and everything's amazing. Then we have these two conflicting statements, basically saying, but what if you don't learn that way? So on the one hand, you have the Gemara that says, it's okay, start out that way, and then eventually, hopefully, it'll become lishma. Then you have another Gemara that says, no, because that better that you were never created if you're going to not learn for its own sake. And we're saying that means that you are learning Torah for a strictly ulterior motive that is a negative ulterior motive versus a positive ulterior motive. And that is where the Gemara says it's okay if you do it like that. In its meantime, okay. We still have yet to define what lishma is, though. I want to know what I know I'm not supposed to learn for negative ulterior motives. That I know. But I don't know where the line is between the Gemara Psachim and the Brisa at the end of Avos, right? The Gemara Psachim tells me it's okay not to learn Lishma. Eventually, it will become Lishma. And then I have the Brisa and Avos telling me that if you do learn Lishma, it's amazing. But what is Lishma? I know what it isn't. I know it isn't learning Torah for negative ulterior motives. But what is doing it Lishma? What is then the highest level? What is the polar opposite of that? So here comes Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, founder of Volozhin Yeshiva. So he was the star pupil of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon died in 1792. Also a very, very fascinating story of Reb Chaim Volozhiner wanting to set up the Volozhin Yeshiva. The Vilna Gaon was born in 1720, and he died in 1792. But Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who was the star pupil of the Vilna Gaon, and how do I know is the star pupil of the Vilna Gaon? Because the Gra's own children said about Reb Chaim Volozhiner that he was the star pupil, that he was the closest to the Vilna Gaon. So the Vilna Gaon, so Reb Chaim Volozhiner wouldn't do anything unless his Rebbe gave approval to it. So the first time, I believe it was in the 1780s, that Reb Chaim Volozhiner went over to the Gra and asked him what his thoughts were about setting up the Volozhin Yeshiva. The Gra brushed it off. He didn't think it was such a great idea. He didn't think it was such a great idea. So he didn't do it. And then about a year or two before the Gra passed away, Reb Chaim Volozhiner came back to him and asked him again. And for whatever reason, the Vilna Gaon said, now's the time to do it. And apparently it was because the first time around, Rav Chaim Volozhiner was not as lishma, and this time he was more lishma. Okay. So in the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, which is Rav Chaim Volozhiner's work on Jewish philosophy, he has an essay about what the definition of lishma is. And it's absolutely fascinating. So we're going to read through parts of it. We're not going to go through the whole essay. We'll read through parts of it. Absolutely fascinating. We're going to go through two perspectives on how to define lishma. One from Rav Chaim Volozhiner and one from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement. So let's start with Rav Chaim Volozhiner. Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes like this. In an Esek HaTorah Lishma, that when we talk about learning Torah for quote unquote Lishma, its own sake, Ha'emes Habar, that we have to define exactly what that means. We have to give it a clear definition. Ki Lishma, because I'll tell you what it isn't. What Lishma isn't, in Perushu Dveikos, it doesn't mean connectivity to God. Now this is very important. The students of the Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, if the 18th century Jewry was being written by DC Comics, they would put the Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Gra pinned up against the Baal Tanya and the Baal Shem Tov as I don't know, Lex Luthor and Superman. Okay, I don't know who is who. I'm not making a statement about who would be who. But it's interesting. Every once in a while, you'll see little digs to the Hasidic movement that are found in the Nefesh HaChaim. So in Rav Chaim Volozhiner's main work on Jewish philosophy that was accepted by we'll call them the Misnagdim, those that were against the Hasidic movement. So every once in a while, you find little digs. So this is one of them where he says, "I'll tell you what it isn't," and it's the way that the Hasidim define lishma. How did the Hasidim define lishma? They define it as dveikos be'elokim, just connection to God. That when you learn Torah, why are you learning Torah? You're learning Torah because it is the closest way to connect with God. God presents himself in this world through the Torah. We connect to God. We can speak to God through prayer. God speaks to us through Torah, which if you stop and consider that, which is true, by the way, the Rabbi Volozhiner wouldn't argue with that. That is 100% true. God presents himself to the world through Torah. It's the way to understand God, which would mean then that when one learns Torah, it could perhaps be a more lofty connection to God than through prayer, because prayer is dependent on my own finite reality, that whatever my mental capacity is and the way that I can connect to God, shooting upwards, is finite. But when it comes to learning Torah, Torah is infinite. It's endless, right? So when you're delving into the depths of Torah, it could be the closest connection to God in the world. So this is what Hasidim felt. The more a person experiences that dveikos be'elokim, that's the lishma we're shooting for. That connectivity is the highest level of learning. Chaim Volozhiner felt that is not what the definition of lishma is. It's not what it is, and he proves it actually. Fascinating proof. He quotes from. This comes up in a couple of different places. He quotes from Medrash about David HaMelech. That David HaMelech beseeches God. He prays to God. David HaMelech was famous for praying. He says, "Shebikesh David HaMelech ala shalom l'lefanav yisparach." David prays to God, and he asked him, "Sha'osek b'tehillim," that when I am saying over my Tehillim, when I'm writing the Tehillim, when I'm editing the Tehillim, that all of the work I'm doing, I'm creating the Psalms." He asked God that, God, you should view that, you should view that as as if I am learning Negaim and Olos. Negaim and Olos are two of the most esoteric types of Torah. It has to do with, Negaim has to do with laws of tsaras, of different type of blemishes, whether or not a person would be pure or impure, and Olos has to do with contracting tumah, contracting impurity, very, very, very theoretical and esoteric aspects of Torah learning. So David HaMelech is asking God, please, all the time that I've spent writing the Tehillim and preparing the Tehillim and saying the Tehillim and doing all the Psalms, that it should be in your eyes as if I was studying Torah. What does that mean? That studying Torah is a higher level than connectivity to God. what's the way that we connect to God in a very practical sense? Prayer. Prayer is dvekas b'Elokim. Prayer is connecting to God. So if we define learning Torah for its own sake as connecting to God, then it would be the same thing as prayer. But David is clearly saying that learning Torah is higher than prayer. So that's Reb Chaim Volozhiner's textual proof to say that it must be then that learning Torah for its own sake is different than just simply connecting to God. So then what is it? He asks more questions, by the way. He says, number one is that you could also say that you can connect to God by simply learning one Mishnah, right? You don't necessarily need to learn everything, but we know that the ideal is that a Jew is supposed to learn everything that's contained within the Torah. So again, we see that there's a disparity here between simply connecting to God and learning Torah. Learning Torah must be something that's higher, something more meaningful. So he writes in the next chapter, this is all in the fourth section of Sefer of the Nefesh HaChaim. Now the third chapter, he writes like this. Now what does Lishma actually mean? So I'll tell you. He says, L'shem HaTorah, for the sake of the Torah, so that Torah is brought more into this world. That there is something that happens when Torah is brought into the world. That if Torah just sat on a shelf and collected dust, so what is it? What is it there for? The purpose of Torah is to be studied, is to be learned, is so that it can be manifested in this world. God wants it that Torah is manifested in this world. If it's not, so then the world is lacking something. Learning Torah Lishma, posits Reb Chaim Volozhiner, learning Torah for the sake of the world. So the world can be improved. The more Torah that is brought into the world, the better the world is off. That's it. That's the bottom line.
You have to bring it into the world. Does that count for somebody sitting isolated and studying Torah all day? For that person?
Yeah, that's what he's assuming.
That counts.
Now, with that said, that is going to we'll try and bring it into a mathematical sense. If one person is studying Torah just for themselves and keeping it to themselves, so that is one part Torah, right? Mm-hmm. But if you have two people studying together, so now the Torah that is being studied is compounded, being that there's a back and forth, and being that you now just doubled the amount of Torah. Now, more than that, is that now you have two people that when they interact with the world, right, they're vectors for Torah. What? Of course. Yeah. Right? So now, of course. So now don't just leave it to two people. Now take a yeshiva with 500 people in it, and all of them are going out into the world and interacting. And so what's happening is just there's more and more and more and more and more Torah. That's an infinite amount of Torah that's being brought into the world. The world is better off now that there's more Torah being brought into the world. So that is without he proves it. There's a statement that's made by the Rush, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel of the early 14th century, also seems to posit the same idea. And that is 100% true. And I think that's the first, even just leaving it at that, I think that's the first definition we can come to, that learning Torah for its own sake, all of these amazing things happen because, and let's go back to the Mishnah. What are the things that happen? What are the things that happen when a person learns the Shema? So if a person does that, first of all, it would be enough for the world to have been created for them. Why? Because now the world has reached its mission of the Torah being studied in the world. The Torah, when God created the world was created, it says in the Zohar, Histakel bel Raiso bara alma. God looked into the Torah and created the world. What exactly that means, exactly how that functions, is a discussion for another time. But either way, there is something to be said about part of the mission of the world, of the creation of the world, was for the Torah to be manifested within it. So again, one person that learns lishma, meaning they're learning for the sake of Torah being brought into the world, is perhaps worth it for the whole world to have been created for this one individual. And then we continue. And they also are considered a friend. Why? Because they are contributing to the purpose of the world. They are ahuv. By definition, they'll be beloved. By definition, they are going to be loved by God. They're going to be people are going to appreciate them. Now, my only issue with this explanation of Chaim Volozhiner is it does not necessarily answer that Oevas Abrios, that me, the learner, is going to love all creations. Because based on this definition of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, essentially the purpose of Torah is for the world's sake. It's beyond me. It almost has less of an effect on me than it is going to have on everybody else. But for me and how it has an effect on me, Rav Chaim never really answered that, right? So for this, I think we have to take the approach of Rabbi Saul Salanter. Rabbi Saul Salanter, also of 19th century fame, was really the revolutionary behind the study of Musar in a systematic way, of character perfection, to be studied in such a way that it would it would have a direct impact on a person in the way that they carry themselves and they function. So he has Yisrael Salanter. He never really published anything himself. The only thing he ever published himself was a small little essay that he wrote called the Igeres HaMusar. He published, interestingly enough, he published it in 1858, about 6 years after the Netziv became 5 years after the Netziv became the Rosh Yeshiva of the Voloshin Yeshiva. So he published this essay called the Igeres HaMusar. That was really the kickoff for the Musar movement, where he published this essay convincing everybody why it's necessary to study Musar. It is an unbelievable essay. It's unbelievable. It's amazing. There were, though, other writings of Rabbi Saul Salanter, letters that he would write to students, other essays of his that he never published, but posthumously, his student, Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, Rabbi Saul Salanter had three major students. His three major students were Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, and Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv. Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv was the author of Kelm. Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam was the one who opened up the Beis HaMusar, which is the study house that continued the mission of Rabbi Saul Salanter. And Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer really became more famous in the area of halacha, became a major posek. He's a genius. So he also, though, published posthumously all of these other letters from his Rebbe, from Rabbi Saul Salanter. So in one of the letters, in the 29th letter, in this book called Or Yisrael, the light of Israel, the light of Rabbi Saul Salanter. So in the 29th letter, Rabbi Saul Salanter talks about the concept of learning Torah lishma, and exactly what the definition is of that, and why it's so important. Why it's so, and he even just deals with the basic concept of why it's so important to learn Torah, and that how that really affects every single aspect of our lives. Every single aspect of our lives is directly impacted by us studying Torah. It's almost the exact same philosophy that we said over last week from Rabbi Soloveitchik about that when one delves into the depths of halacha, it creates an outlook for a person in general. Rabbi Saul Salanter says it's not necessarily halacha. All Torah learning, if done for its own sake, which we'll define in just a moment, can have a direct impact on your life in every single aspect and walk of your life. So I'll read the English translation that was put together. It's not perfect, but the Hebrew is a very, very poetic Hebrew that I speak frankly, I did not understand all of it. It's a very, very flowery and poetic Hebrew from Rabbi Saul Salanter, similar to like Rav Kook. Rav Kook's writings, when he talks about philosophy, his writings on halacha are very easy to understand. It's written in a normal fashion. His writings in Jewish philosophy and thought are written in a much more flowery language. So I'll read this English translation that I think captures mostly exactly what he's trying to posit. He writes as this: that when a person makes an ironclad rule, disciplining himself to act according to the dictates of the laws, then all the winds of the world will not budge him from his place. Okay, what's he responding to? What he's responding to is what he had just written earlier in the letter, is basically talking about, as we mentioned before, what not lishma is, what it means to really go against the grain of what the Torah is trying to teach you. So, for example, he says that let's say a person decides that this sukkah, I'm going to take the most perfect lulav and esrog, most perfect lulav and esrog. Okay, so they go and they find the most perfect lulav and esrog. Then they get to shul and they see the guy 2 rows behind them has an even better one, and he could have sworn that he had the nicest one. So what does he do? He swaps it out. He steals the other guy's lulav and esrog. He has the most beautiful lulav and esrog in the entire world, right? Now he has the best one, right? That's ridiculous. Everybody's laughing, right? Why? Because no one in the right mind could ever assume that is the fulfillment, that is a way to fulfill the mitzvah. It's absurd. Right? It's absolutely absurd, right? So he says that the way that a person can combat themselves, that's obviously not lishma. It's the polar opposite of lishma. So how is one supposed to combat that? You make an ironclad rule for yourself that you are going to discipline yourself to keep to the Torah and the mitzvahs exactly the way that they're prescribed. That's the rule you make for yourself. Even if his intention is not l'shem shamayim, even if his intentions are not for the sake of heaven, as the Gemara in Pesachim said, remember the Gemara in Pesachim said that it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect intention for the sake of heaven. If he steadily seeks to improve his actions and fortify his behavior, then the force of his personal inclinations will be weakened. So Rabbi Salanter is assuming that it's an ongoing pursuit, that it's not something that is just automatically a person's going to be able to perform all of the mitzvot with perfect intention. And a person is going to learn Torah with perfect intention all the time. No. Well, the Shema means that you're doing it for the sake of God, meaning that I'm constantly trying to improve on myself. I'm constantly trying to get closer to God or to fulfill the mitzvah in a better way. It's a constant pursuit, is what Rabbi Salanter is defining as lishma. Since he prevails upon himself to perform the mitzvah correctly, even though its requirements are at odds with his subjective desires and goals, meaning even though he wants the perfect lulav, but nevertheless, the laws of how to fulfill the mitzvah are going to be at odds. They're going to they're going to contradict what you want and what your desires are. So then he will eventually overcome his proclivities. Eventually, he's going to overcome his proclivities. That's all. It's just going to happen. If you're constantly in pursuit of trying to do things the right way, then eventually your desire is going to change to doing it the right way, right? I've seen that with Rav Shechter Shlita. When you spend a lot of time with someone who's a tzaddik like that, so you pick up on these things. I'll never forget that the Shulchan Aruch is rather very clear that during davening, you're supposed to daven. Which I know it's going to sound, that's a big chiddush, right? During davening, you're supposed to daven. It's very clear like that in Shulchan Aruch. Even, you're not supposed to learn. Learning is for learning time, not for davening time. Davening is for davening time. And it sounds elementary, but I mean, it's everybody does it. How many people are, right? I've also committed such sins where in the middle of the repetition of the Chazan Zamida, you pick up an interesting article, you pick up an interesting sefer, right? That's what we all do. Shulchan Aruch is rather clear on the matter that this is not what you're supposed to do. Rav Shechter, I've never, not once, seen him open up a sefer during davening. Not once, never. The only thing I've ever seen him do was one time I saw him open up a Gemara during the Mishaberach, during Torah learning. That in between aliyos, I've seen him open up a Gemara for a moment, close it before even the bracha is being uttered. Just literally during the Mishaberach, I've seen while the person's going back to their seat, just for a moment. Never learns during davening. I'll never forget one time I was davening next to Rav Shechter, and it was getting to the end of davening, and his feet are together, standing upright like a soldier. It is Aleinu, finishing davening. Last Kaddish after Shir Shayom, last Kaddish, the last Amen is said. He closes his sefer and he runs to the bookshelf. Like there was something that was on his mind that he needed to go check out from one of the, and I'm assuming that whatever it was that was on his mind, he ran over and grabbed open a Mishnah. So I took a picture of it. You know what? Let me show you. Marina, just 1 second. I'll show you. It's mind-blowing when you see it. It's worth it to see. There it is. Mamish, look. Can everyone see this? I'll share my screen, Marina, so you can see it also. Okay. So
Yeah.
what happened there? What happened was, here we go, share content, screen broadcast, start broadcast, 2, 1, here we go, sharing your screen. Now, does that mean I can do this? Marina, do you see this picture? Okay.
Yes, I do.
You do?
Amazing.
Okay. Right. So if you look, so you see Rav Shechter, he still has his talis and tefillin on, okay? This is a good 30 yards from his seat, okay? At some point in the middle of davening, must be that something started knocking at his head, that he needed to go look up, whatever it was. It happened to be, it was a Mishnah that he pulled out. He needed to go look up some Mishnah, some parish of the Rambam on the Mishnah. He needed to go look up something, okay? But he would not budge from davening. He would not. The second davening was over, though, he ran. So it's the person next to him, by the way, is Rabbi Cohen, who it could be you've heard me quote Rabbi Cohen in the past. That's Rabbi Cohen. He's a major tzaddik. That's what Rabbi Salanter is describing. That when a person is so dedicated to do things the right way, that's their pursuit is, I want to do it the way that God intended that it's done. So then any other inclinations, desires, proclivities, it's not going to hinder a person from fulfillment of the mitzvos the right way. And this is what he continues. And he says as follows. He says, at that point, he will have reached the level of lishma. This is lishma. This is implied in the above quoted passage from Maseches Pesachim. Remember, the Gemara Pesachim says that La'olam Yazog Adam Shelo Lishma. A person should do Torah mitzvos not for its own sake, and then eventually you'll do it for its own sake. What does that mean? What it means is that you're going to start out doing mitzvos, and the struggle to do it in the way you want to do it is going to be different from the way that it's supposed to be done. And then eventually it's going to turn into you doing it for its own sake. Learning Torah is the same thing. Learning Torah, that's what he continues, that learning Torah also, that a person could start out wanting to learn Torah, like Toso said. It's not that it's a negative ulterior motive. You have a positive ulterior motive why you want to learn Torah. You want to learn Torah in order so that you can get smicha from a yeshiva, so you can be a Talmid Chacham, so that you know how to, what people give you honor, whatever it might be. That's a way to start. But eventually, the more that you learn Torah and you're learning Torah because you want to understand God's will in this world, so then the more you are going to be headed in that direction. Now that can impact every single aspect of your life, because the more that you attach yourself to the Torah in that kind of way, with the pure intention of not trying to connect with God, like the Hasidim said, but rather trying to understand God, so then you're going to be someone who is, as the Mishnah said, we'll read the Mishnah again, the Brisa again. You're going to be a person who is a friend and is beloved and that loves God and loves other people, has proper v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and gives nachas to Hashem and nachas to other people. All of these accolades are going to be given to such a person because they're a person that understands God in the world, and that their own personal desires have been transformed into God's desires. That is ultimately, so this is why we are so crazy about learning Torah. Why are we so crazy about learning Torah? Why do we spend so much of our time and energy on learning Torah? We spend so much of our time and energy on learning Torah because it's the way to do life the right way. It's the way to understand God.
condition that you're coming to it with the right intent.
But on condition you're going to be doing it with the right intent. If you're going to be studying Torah, exactly right. If you're going to be studying Torah, like the Netziv said, just so that you can make a pretty penny on a yeshiva. So what are you doing? That's not going to get you anywhere. That is not why we are so crazy about. We are so crazy about learning Torah if it's going to have an impact on your life's perspective.
So
That's
Rabbi Salanter was coming to it from a character development standpoint.
really purely character development standpoint.
Ultimately, with how you interact with the world.
Yeah, it's about how you're going to interact with the world. Yeah, how you're with the world and with your relationship with God. Yeah, in the way you perform mitzvahs and the way you interact with other people. Speaking of Torah learning, this Sunday is a major celebration of Torah. YU is having their I don't even know how you call it. Once every 4 years. What do you call that? Quad. I don't even know how you say that. Once every 4 years, YU has this major celebration. The Chag HaSmicha, celebrating all of the musmachim, all of the rabbis that they endowed ordination onto over the last 4 years. This Chag HaSmicha, they are celebrating 150 rabbis that received smicha with and Rabbi Schechter. Every single Chag HaSmicha, he gets up and he says the same thing. In fact, he says something a particular musar for out-of-town rabbis. This is the same particular musar for out-of-town rabbis. He said that many of you are going to go out to communities all over the world. He said, don't fool yourselves that you're going to go and you're going to convince yourself that you're the biggest Talmid Chacham in the entire world, because you're going to meet people that don't necessarily know a lot of things. And so every time that someone asks you a question and they don't know the answer, and most people there don't know the answer, and you happen to know the answer, but it's something that every single guy in Smicha knows the answer to. Don't kid yourself that you're some big. He tells a story that there was once a Muslim from the yeshiva that ended up in, I don't want to say the wrong community, somewhere in the Midwest, somewhere out in Yehupitzville, and the person started referring to themselves as the chief rabbi of whatever that place was, right? Somewhere out there. So and how true it is now that we've studied, what true Torah Lishma is. That he's 100% right. That a person that could so easily convince themselves that they are some big hotshot, when in reality it's not even your Torah, right? You're studying Hashem's Torah. You're trying to give over the Dvar Hashem to the world. I think we mentioned the Tanaim and Amoraim, the way they used to learn, the scholars that are found in the Mishnah and the Gemara, the way they used to learn when you have a machlokas in Shammai and Hillel, a machlokas in Ravina, Ravashi, Abai and Rava. You know what the way they used to talk? The way they used to talk is that I believe that the will of God is that you're supposed to lean during the first 2 cups of wine at the Seder. And the other opinion would say, this is what we were just studying, the workman's call. The other opinion would say that, no, I believe the will of God is that you lean during the second 2 sets of the second set of wine at the Seder. That they would, that the way that they would even speak is in that way. It creates a completely different perspective, but it has to start with that mentality. It has to start with the mentality of Lishma, the way that Rabbi Salanter is describing, that it's Lishma, that I am trying to live a life of pursuit to understand God, to create a closeness, not just a closeness with God, to understand God. And in that way, it's going to impact my character in the way that I interact with other people. But I think both are true. You can't ignore Reb Chaim Volozhiner either. Chaim Volozhiner is 100% right. That and by the way, when you put the two together, how much more so is Reb Chaim Volozhiner true? Assuming if Reb Chaim Volozhiner was assuming that Rabbi Salanter was correct, then how much more so is Reb Chaim Volozhiner's statement true? The Reb Chaim Volozhiner said the definition of the Shema is that you are trying to bring more of godliness into the world. You're helping the world fulfill its mission. So much more so. you imagine if all the Torah that's studied in this world is having an impact on the students that are studying the Torah in such a way that it is totally developing their character, that they become different people? Mashiach would come tomorrow. That's the bottom line.
His opposition to Dveikus was because that was a more selfish reason and not necessarily going out to the world.
So he doesn't say, I don't know if he says that. I don't know if he says that reasoning, but it's interesting though, because I think that Hasidim would say, and that's why the whole machlokas between the Hasidim and the Snagdim was, now we know that it was ultimately quite silly, because we agree on pretty much everything. And I think that the Baal Shem Tov would say that the more connectivity you have to God, so the more that has an effect on you as well. And therefore it's going to have an effect on the way that you interact with other people. I think it's just two different directions of how to get to the ultimate same goal. Yeah. All right. Very good. Okay. Next week, the question, I don't know, unless Dr. Lincoln has another question, we'll have to see. We'll have to, next week's question, to be tuned. I know, right? Life's biggest question. That's actually a good idea. Okay. There's a reason they made you the president. Okay. Everybody. Thank you guys.
Having their convention this week.